April 16, 1944. The skies over central Germany trembled under the thunder of engines. High above the patchwork fields and forests, sunlight glinted off silver wings that cut through the blue like blades. At first, the Luftwaffe pilots laughed. They had mocked the Americans for months, sneering at the so-called cowboy flyers, with their awkward training and fragile machines. Clumsy, weak, undisciplined, the German veterans muttered as they rolled their sleek Messerschmitts into position. From the ground, anti-aircraft crews watched with confidence. They had seen American formations scatter like sheep when attacked, their bombers mauled, their escorts too few and too slow. But on that day, something was different. The formation approaching wasn't a timid flock. It was a storm. Dozens of fighters stretched across the horizon, their silhouettes sharp, their movements deliberate. P-51 Mustangs, sleek and menacing, flew in disciplined swarms. They didn't break. They didn't scatter. They moved as one, as if guided by an unseen hand. Engines roared with a feral hunger. Radios crackled in English, crisp and coordinated. And then, in an instant, they struck. German pilots dove to meet them, confident in their years of training, their hardened reputations. But the first clash shredded that arrogance. A Messerschmitt banked to fire and vanished in a burst of flame as a Mustang tore across its flank. Another German pulled hard to the right, but the American stayed glued to his tail like a hawk locked on prey. A burst of .50 caliber tracers lit the sky, and another Luftwaffe ace spiraled down in smoke. On the ground, gunners shouted in disbelief. These weren't the clumsy novices they had jeered. These were predators, disciplined and merciless. The battlefield in the sky transformed into a spectacle of chaos. Mustangs darted through clouds, their long noses slicing the air, their packs hunting in pairs and wings. Germans, once the hunters, found themselves confused, overwhelmed. The mockery that had filled Luftwaffe barracks now curdled into dread. Radio chatter grew frantic, voices rising in panic as formations broke apart. "They're everywhere," one voice cried. "We can't shake them." Another screamed, cut short by static and fire. For years, the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies with contemptuous confidence. Their pilots, many forged in the crucible of the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front, believed themselves untouchable. They mocked the Americans as amateurs, their tactics primitive, their flyers reckless. Yet now in the heart of the Reich, those same German veterans were hunted. The skies that once belonged to them had turned hostile, filled with relentless silver phantoms that would not let go. One German ace, flying low over the Thuringian forests, looked back in disbelief. A Mustang held tight on his tail, no matter how sharp he banked, no matter how desperate his maneuvers. It was as though the American aircraft read his every move before he made it. He dove, he climbed, he twisted into cloud. Still, the Mustang's guns spoke. The ace had mocked American pilots as soft men, incapable of matching German discipline. Now he was praying for survival, hunted like prey in a sky that was no longer his. In that moment, the Luftwaffe confronted a new reality. The Americans had brought not only new machines, but a new kind of war. The Mustang was not just a fighter. It was a symbol of industrial might, of tactical evolution, of lessons learned from bitter defeat. Where once the bombers had been helpless, lambs led to slaughter. Now they flew under the wings of guardians who could match the Germans blow for blow. The transformation had not come overnight. It was forged in blood, in the losses of 1943 when American bombers fell by the hundreds, when daylight raids seemed suicidal. It was born from the cries of crews who never returned, from the fields of wreckage that dotted Europe. And it came to life in the form of the P-51, a machine born of necessity and perfected by design. The Germans had laughed at American weakness. They would not laugh much longer. The air war over Germany had shifted. Every contrail, every shadow in the sky carried the weight of inevitability. For the first time, Luftwaffe pilots felt what their enemies had endured, the sense of being outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outclassed. The Mustang wasn't just another fighter. It was a spectre, a hunter that turned German arrogance into German funerals. And as smoke trailed across the spring skies of 1944, the laughter that once filled Luftwaffe mess halls fell silent. This was no longer the war they remembered. This was a new chapter, written in fire and steel, where the hunters had become the hunted, and the once mocked weak pilots of America rose from ridicule to dominance. By 1943, the war in Europe had reached a fevered pitch. The German Wehrmacht still occupied vast swathes of territory, but the momentum that once carried them across continents was beginning to falter. In the East, the colossal struggle against the Soviet Union drained men, fuel, and machines at an unsustainable rate. In the West, a new front opened in the skies above Europe. The Allies, determined to crush the Reich's industrial heart, launched massive daylight bombing campaigns. Armadas of American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators soared across the Channel, their contrails stitching white scars against the heavens. The mission was bold, and it was brutal. Unlike the British, who struck by night, the Americans believed precision daylight bombing could cripple German war production, shatter morale, and force the Reich to its knees. But daylight brought visibility, and visibility brought slaughter. The bombers, lumbering giants bristling with guns, proved vulnerable to waves of German fighters. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s tore into formations with terrifying efficiency, often downing dozens of aircraft in a single mission. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies, and the mocking laughter of German pilots echoed through their airfields. To the Luftwaffe, the Americans were fools. "Suicidal cowboys," one German ace sneered. They mocked the green American crews who flew into the cauldron of flak and interceptors, with wide eyes and raw nerves. The Luftwaffe veterans, seasoned by years of combat, dismissed these newcomers as children playing at war. Time and again, the Americans suffered staggering losses, entire squadrons vanishing in flame and smoke before they ever reached their targets. The Luftwaffe believed this imbalance permanent, their dominance unshakable. Yet behind the American lines, voices of alarm grew louder. Generals understood that without proper fighter escort, the bomber offensive would bleed the U.S. Army Air Forces dry. Aircraft factories in Detroit and Seattle could build more bombers, but they could not so easily replace the thousands of trained airmen falling into German soil each month. Something had to change. The hunt for a long-range escort fighter became a desperate race. At first, the Americans experimented with what they had. P-47, Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, formidable in their own right, were pushed to their limits. They fought bravely, but they lacked the range to escort bombers deep into Germany. Time and again, they were forced to turn back, leaving the heavy bombers naked above the Reich's industrial core. The Luftwaffe knew this well, lying in wait for the moment American escorts peeled away, then diving mercilessly into the unprotected bomber streams. In late 1943, the air war seemed a losing gamble. Raids on Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Bremen left cemeteries full and morale shaken. Crews whispered about Black Thursday, when the skies turned into graveyards and half the bombers failed to return. In Berlin and Munich, the German press mocked the Americans as reckless and weak, their pilots unskilled, their strategy doomed. Even on Allied airfields in England, doubts spread like smoke. But hidden within these dark months was a turning point. Engineers, strategists, and industrialists worked feverishly to answer the desperate question: how to escort bombers from takeoff to target across hundreds of miles of hostile skies. The solution would emerge not in bold strokes of strategy, but in steel and design, a new kind of aircraft, born from cooperation between British innovation and American industry. The British had already designed the nimble Supermarine Spitfire, a fighter legendary for its role in the Battle of Britain. Yet the Spitfire lacked endurance for long-range escort. Meanwhile, a company called North American Aviation, tasked initially with building fighters for Britain, developed something unique. Their P-51 Mustang was swift, elegant, and surprisingly fuel-efficient. Its sleek lines, laminar flow wing, and powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it speed at altitude and range never before seen. By early 1944, squadrons of these new machines began to appear on English airfields. At first, German intelligence dismissed them as another experiment, another weak attempt at challenging the Luftwaffe. But whispers spread among American crews. They called it the Cadillac of the skies. Pilots who had once dreaded crossing into Germany now spoke with pride, their confidence reborn. For the Luftwaffe, the storm clouds were gathering. Their strategy depended on overwhelming unescorted bombers. But what if the bombers never flew alone again? What if those weak pilots the Germans had mocked were suddenly backed by a machine that could follow them to Berlin and back? In the mess halls of Luftwaffe bases, confidence still reigned. German aces spoke of kill tallies in the hundreds, of invincibility in the cockpit. They toasted to their mastery of the air and laughed at the raw Americans fumbling into combat. Yet beneath the laughter, reality was shifting. The Reich's factories were already strained. Fuel supplies dwindled, training programs shortened, sending boys into cockpits with only weeks of preparation. The Americans, with their endless factories and limitless manpower, were learning, adapting, evolving. The air war was no longer a one-sided hunt. The hunters had grown complacent, while their prey sharpened its claws. Soon the Germans would face swarms unlike anything they had ever imagined. Disciplined, relentless, and armed with machines designed to erase the Luftwaffe's edge. The mockery that filled German barracks would soon be silenced by a new sound, the whistle of Merlin. Engines and the thunder of Mustangs sweeping across the Reich. The Americans were coming, and they were no longer weak. They were ready to dominate the skies. The secret unfolded not in thunderous declarations, but in the quiet hum of machinery, in the lines of factories, and in the wings of an aircraft few had taken seriously. The Germans had mocked American pilots as clumsy, unskilled, their machines crude and lacking finesse. Yet when the P-51 Mustang entered the fray, it carried with it something the Luftwaffe had not anticipated: endurance, coordination, and an invisible web of connection that transformed the air war. For years, German doctrine had thrived on short, decisive strikes. Their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were deadly hunters, but they were sprinters, not marathoners. Each sortie was bound by fuel tanks and limited range. German pilots scrambled, struck, and returned. By contrast, the Americans introduced a weapon that could stay, linger, and hunt with patience. The Mustang, fitted with drop tanks, stretched across the skies of Europe with uncanny reach. It was not simply a fighter, it was a shadow that refused to leave. Bombers that once flew naked across the heart of the Reich now had guardians perched above and around them. Where the Luftwaffe once calculated the moment escorts would turn back, they now found themselves harried all the way to the very gates of Berlin. The unseen advantage was no longer just firepower. It was persistence. The Mustang's range erased the Luftwaffe's greatest weapon, the certainty of timing. But range was only part of the story. Hidden within the cockpit was another quiet revolution: the radio. American coordination reached levels the Germans had not envisioned. Clear, crackle-free communication linked entire formations into a single organism. Mustang pilots spoke in unbroken chains of commands and warnings, weaving their squadrons into flexible, disciplined packs. Where German fighters often acted independently, relying on visual cues and leader-follow instincts, the Americans fought like wolves with a shared mind. German intelligence officers scribbled reports in disbelief. The enemy fighters appear coordinated in groups of unexpected efficiency, one noted after a disastrous raid. Luftwaffe pilots, who once mocked the Americans for chaotic flying, suddenly found themselves overwhelmed by seamless maneuvers, ambushes sprung with perfect timing. The mocking laughter of aces who called Americans weak began to sound hollow as more of their comrades failed to return. There was also the matter of the engine, a collaboration that bridged continents. The early Mustangs, powered by Allison engines, had been fast at low altitude, but lacked breath in the thin skies above 20,000 feet, where the bombers flew. The Germans dismissed them as unthreatening escorts, incapable of challenging high-altitude intercepts. But when the Rolls-Royce Merlin, refined in British factories and married to American frames, was introduced, the game changed. The Mustang became a predator, even at the highest altitudes, its roar a harbinger of doom for any German fighter daring to climb. This marriage of British ingenuity and American mass production created not just an aircraft, but a symbol of Allied cooperation. It revealed another hidden advantage the Germans had long underestimated: industry. The Reich could produce superb fighters, but not in endless waves. American factories, fed by rivers of steel and oil, churned out Mustangs by the thousands. Each one that fell was swiftly replaced, while German aces fought on with dwindling numbers, their replacements barely trained boys. Psychologically, the transformation was devastating. For years, Luftwaffe veterans enjoyed the arrogance of superiority. They spoke of kindergarten pilots and easy prey. But by early 1944, those same men were forced to admit what their eyes could no longer deny. The Americans had learned. The once weak pilots now flew machines that outlasted, outclimbed, and outgunned them. Worse still, they fought with unity the Luftwaffe's fractured wings could not match. American pilots, once hesitant, grew bolder with every mission. They no longer merely escorted, they hunted. Mustangs roamed the skies, swooping down on airfields, strafing trains, attacking columns. The Luftwaffe's sanctuary, once the airbases of the Reich, was now a killing ground. German crews whispered in dread as silver shapes appeared at dawn, tearing through hangars and fuel dumps. The hunters had become the hunted, and the mocking tone that had once filled Luftwaffe ready rooms dissolved into silence. In Berlin, commanders pored over intelligence. They had laughed when the Americans first deployed their daylight strategy. They had laughed when P-38s and P-47s fell short of range. But laughter turned to frowns as reports mounted. The P-51 escorts bombers to Leipzig. The P-51 is over Munich. The P-51 attacks near Berlin. Each report stripped away confidence. Each loss dug deeper into the myth of invincibility. The hidden advantage was not a single feature. It was a trinity of endurance, coordination, and relentless production. The Mustang could be everywhere, communicate with everyone, and arrive in numbers too vast to counter. To the Germans, it was as if the Americans had conjured a new kind of war. Luftwaffe morale frayed. Young pilots entering combat for the first time, already shaken by inadequate training, faced swarms of Mustangs before they even found the bomber streams. Veterans who once strutted with pride now cursed the skies, realizing they were trapped in a war of attrition they could not win. Mockery of American weakness gave way to grudging respect, then to fear. By the spring of 1944, the Reich's air war had inverted. German civilians who once cheered the sight of their fighters scrambling now watched with dread, knowing few would return. American bombers, once defenseless lambs, now marched across the sky with wolves at their side. And in those wolves, in the sleek silhouette of the P-51 Mustang, lay the hidden advantage that would doom the Luftwaffe and shatter the myth of German air supremacy. The Mustang was more than a machine, it was an answer to a riddle of war. To understand why German arrogance dissolved into fear, one must look not only at the smoke and fire of combat, but at the cold steel, the wires, and the engineering genius behind this aircraft. Every rivet, every curve, every bolt in its frame told a story of foresight and necessity, of a weapon designed to solve problems the Luftwaffe never thought could be solved. Its heart was the engine. Early Mustangs, powered by the Allison V1710, were swift at low altitudes but faltered where the air grew thin. At 20,000 feet, the realm where bombers lumbered and German interceptors struck, the Allison suffocated. Luftwaffe pilots mocked the Mustang as a curiosity, a sleek but toothless bird. That mockery ended when the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, refined in Britain and produced under license by Packard in the United States, was fused to the Mustang's airframe. The result was staggering. The Merlin V1650 gave the Mustang the breath of the gods. With a two-stage, two-speed supercharger, it delivered power at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where German Bf-109s and FW-190s had once hunted without rival. Suddenly the Mustang could climb with the best, sprint at speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour, and still retain the endurance to escort bombers to Berlin and back. Where Luftwaffe pilots once sneered, they now cursed, realizing they faced a machine that erased their advantage at every altitude. The wings carried their own secret. North American Aviation's engineers designed a laminar flow wing, its cross-section thinner and smoother than anything seen before. Air hugged the surface, reducing drag, giving the Mustang a grace in flight unmatched by contemporary fighters. In dogfights, this translated into energy efficiency. The Mustang could dive fast, climb hard, and roll with authority, conserving energy where German fighters bled it away. It was a dancer in the sky, light on its feet yet ferocious in its strikes. Armament sealed its role as a predator. 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns lined its wings, spitting streams of fire at over 800 rounds per minute. The guns delivered not just bursts but sustained fury. cutting through aluminum, steel, and flesh with merciless precision. The Luftwaffe's lightly armored cockpits and fuel tanks, once shielded by speed and altitude, became death traps under the Mustang's hail. German pilots who once scoffed at American gunnery soon learned to fear those glowing tracers, streaking across the sky. Yet the true revolution lay not only in what the Mustang carried, but how far it could carry it. Standard fuel capacity stretched its range to 750 miles, already impressive, but with twin 75-gallon drop tanks slung under its wings, the Mustang's reach extended to nearly 1,650 miles. It could take off from English airfields, shepherd bombers over Leipzig, hammer interceptors near Munich, and still return home. German pilots, who once timed their attacks to the escort's retreat, now found Mustangs still circling when their fuel gauges dipped red. The psychological blow was immense. There was no longer a safe zone. Radio technology added another layer to its lethality. The American SCR-522 VHF set offered clarity at ranges exceeding 100 miles, its voice transmissions cutting through static that plagued German FUG-7 radios. Mustang squadrons could coordinate attacks, shift formations, and warn of threats with a seamlessness that baffled Luftwaffe veterans. To Germans, the Americans seemed to anticipate maneuvers, striking from angles no one had expected. In truth, they were simply connected, each pilot a node in a network the Luftwaffe could not replicate. Production power magnified these advantages. By war's end, nearly 15,000 Mustangs had rolled out of factories, each stamped by the relentless engine of American industry. Workers in California, Texas, and Michigan assembled them in endless rows, the hum of machinery a counterpoint to the roar of combat overseas. Each loss was a sting, but not a catastrophe. Another Mustang would take its place within weeks. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages and Allied bombing, could not match this torrent of steel. German intelligence officers dissected captured Mustangs with cold precision. Reports noted the Merlin's supercharger, the smooth wings, the lethal guns. They understood, at least technically, why the Americans now ruled the skies. But understanding did not bring solutions. The Reich lacked the fuel to train new pilots, the aluminum to build comparable machines, the time to respond. The technical marvel they faced was not merely a fighter. It was the embodiment of Allied superiority in design, communication, and production. And there was something else, something intangible. Pilots spoke of the Mustang's feel, the way it responded to the slightest touch, the way it seemed alive. They trusted it. Men who had once climbed into cockpits with dread now strapped themselves into Mustangs with pride, knowing they flew the finest machine of the war. Confidence itself became a weapon as American airmen shifted from merely surviving to seeking battle. The Luftwaffe, drained and desperate, could not stem this tide. Their Bf-109s and FW-190s remained formidable, but their edges dulled against the Mustang's combined arsenal of speed, range, and communication. Where once German superiority had seemed unquestionable, it now collapsed under the weight of innovation and industry. The Mustang was not invincible. No machine of war ever is. But it was enough. Enough to turn the tide, to shield the bombers, to hunt the hunters. Enough to shatter the myth of German air supremacy and to write a new chapter in the skies over Europe. Every bolt, every curve, every gallon of fuel carried meaning. Together they formed the hidden skeleton of Allied victory. And in the roar of a Merlin engine, in the tracers that cut across the sky, one could hear the voice of inevitability. The Reich would burn, and the Mustang would light the fire. September 12, 1944. Dawn broke over the rolling fields of Lorraine, France, the air heavy with mist and the acrid stench of war. The village of Arrogance lay silent, its cobblestone streets scarred by artillery, its fields churned into mud by tanks and boots. Overhead, the rumble of engines echoed through the valley. It was here, in the soft light of morning, that the legend of the Mustang was carved into the sky. The Germans came first, as they always had. The 111th Panzer Brigade, reinforced with Panthers and supported by Luftwaffe squadrons, moved forward with deadly confidence. Their orders were clear: smash the thin American lines, sever supply routes, and remind the Allies that German steel still commanded fear. Above them, formations of Bf-109s and FW-190s circled like vultures, their pilots ready to strike at the lumbering bombers they expected to find. But the bombers did not fly alone anymore. From the west, silver shapes streaked across the mist, sunlight catching their wings as they cut through the morning haze. Dozens of P-51 Mustangs swept into view, their noses long and predatory, their engines howling with a sound that sent chills through the men on the ground. The clash was instantaneous. German fighters dove, eager to pounce, but the Mustangs did not scatter. They turned into the attack, their packs breaking into disciplined flights, their guns already spitting streams of fire. The first Messerschmitt erupted in flame before it could close on the bombers. Air Focke-Wulf rolled desperately, but tracers stitched across its fuselage, tearing it apart in mid-air. For the German pilots, the shock was total. They had expected the usual dance, American escorts turning back, bombers left to fend for themselves, easy kills for the Reich's hunters. Instead, the Mustang stayed, relentless and disciplined. One German ace with over 70 kills to his name described the scene in disbelief after barely escaping alive. They were everywhere. No matter where we turned, a Mustang was already there. The air above Arrogance became a maelstrom. Mustangs weaved between clouds, diving from the sun, climbing in perfect arcs to cut off fleeing foes. Every maneuver seemed anticipated, every German move countered with ruthless efficiency. For the first time, Luftwaffe pilots felt the suffocating weight of an enemy who could not be shaken. Below, American armored divisions advanced, their Shermans grinding forward under the protection of the skies. Reports filtered in from the ground. German armor stalled, German infantry pinned, Luftwaffe air cover broken apart by the storm of silver wings. A Panther caught in the open was strafed by a Mustang, its 50 caliber rounds tearing through hatches and igniting fuel. Columns of smoke rose from both fields and skies, testimony to the new balance of power. The numbers told the story. In just days, 39 German Panthers faced destruction, while their Luftwaffe escorts suffered crippling losses. American casualties were real, but the scales had tipped. For every Mustang that fell, another seemed to arrive, diving into the fray with guns blazing. For every German victory, 10 new defeats piled upon it. After-action reports from the Luftwaffe revealed the depth of their confusion. Commanders wrote of unprecedented coordination, of enemy fighters with impossible range. Some accused their own intelligence services of failure. Others muttered of betrayal by fate itself. The arrogance of years dissolved in the smoke above Arrogance. For the Americans, the battle marked more than a tactical victory. It was vindication. The months of losses, the ridicule endured from both ally and enemy, the countless crews who never returned, all found meaning in the Mustang's triumph. Pilots who once strapped into cockpits with dread now flew with a new swagger, their faith in survival replaced by hunger for the hunt. We weren't just escorting bombers anymore, one Mustang pilot later recalled. We owned the sky. Arrogance was not the only stage for this transformation, but it was one of the clearest. Again and again, through the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe tried to stem the tide. Over Leipzig, Munich, Berlin, the story repeated. German formations rose to meet the bombers, confident in their old rhythms, only to find themselves ambushed, outmaneuvered, destroyed. Each defeat chipped away at the Reich's lifeline of industry. Factories that built tanks, planes, and shells fell silent under the rain of bombs. The German war machine, once fueled by confidence in its air shield, now sputtered under relentless assault. From the cockpit, the experience was surreal. American pilots described the sensation of hunting hunters, of seeing German fighters break and run, of watching veterans once feared across Europe dive for safety. Aerial combat that had once felt like desperate survival became, in their words, a harvest. For German ground troops, the psychological impact was shattering. The Luftwaffe had been their guardian angel, the force that swept enemy bombers from the skies and preserved their faith in eventual victory. Now, instead of protection, they saw Mustangs strafing their convoys, their columns, their very bases. Fear replaced faith. Soldiers muttered that the sky belonged to the enemy, that death could descend at any moment with the scream of a Merlin engine. The Battle of Arrogance, and the countless engagements that followed, revealed a truth the Luftwaffe had refused to see. Their supremacy was gone. Their mockery of American weakness was exposed as hubris, their arrogance shattered by steel and fire. The hunters had not only become the hunted, they were being eradicated, piece by piece until only wreckage remained, and above the smoke, above the ruins of burning fields and shattered towns, the silver wings of the Mustangs stretched on, guardians of the bombers, heralds of an empire in collapse. By the winter of 1944, the transformation was undeniable. The Reich, once guarded by a canopy of confident eagles, now lay exposed beneath a storm of silver wings. What the Luftwaffe had dismissed as weak pilots had become the hammer that crushed its spirit, its formations, and its very purpose. The impact was not merely tactical. It was strategic, psychological, and existential. For the German command, the Mustang was more than a machine. It was a symbol of inevitability. Before its arrival, planners could rely on the natural limits of enemy aircraft. American bombers, they knew, could be savaged deep inside Germany once escorts turned back. Those windows of vulnerability had been the Luftwaffe's lifeblood. With Mustangs circling over Berlin, Munich, and Leipzig, that lifeblood drained away. There were no safe zones left, no predictable moments when the enemy was naked. Every mission became a gamble with odds stacked against survival. The consequences rippled across every level of the German war machine. Production lines in Essen, Hamburg, and the Ruhr that once poured out tanks and munitions now lay in ruins beneath relentless bombing. Oil refineries burned, choking the skies with black plumes. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons, leaving even the finest fighters useless hulks. Pilots sat in mess halls waiting for sorties that never came, listening to the growl of Mustangs above. Germany's industrial heart, once shielded by its proud Luftwaffe, now beat irregularly, its arteries severed by fire from the sky. On the front lines, soldiers felt the weight of abandonment. The Luftwaffe, once a name spoken with reverence, now inspired only bitter silence. Troops advancing by day marched with the knowledge that death might come screaming down in strafing runs. Convoys scattered like frightened animals at the first glint of wings overhead. Trucks, tanks, and trains burned in endless rows, strafed and bombed, until the roads themselves became graveyards of steel. The German army no longer moved with confidence. It crept, hid, and prayed. Psychologically, the shift was devastating. Luftwaffe aces, once icons of German propaganda, returned from missions shaken, their tallies no longer rising, their comrades dwindling by the week. Some stopped flying altogether, feigning illness to avoid the inevitable. Young pilots, rushed from training schools with barely 20 hours in the cockpit, climbed into aircraft already doomed. They entered combat with trembling hands, only to be cut down by veterans in Mustangs who hunted with clinical precision. For every American loss, 10 Germans fell. It was not war, it was attrition, a slow strangulation, and the Americans knew it. For the first time, they flew with the confidence of ownership. "We controlled the sky," one pilot later recalled. "Every mission wasn't just an escort, it was a hunt." Mustangs no longer merely defended bombers. They prowled airfields, strafed supply lines, and ambushed the Luftwaffe before it could even take off. This aggression shattered the last vestiges of German air dominance. When the hunters became the hunted were never safe. The impact on bomber crews was profound. Men who had once counted minutes until escorts returned now felt the presence of guardians from takeoff to target. The Silver Wings, flanking their formations, brought not just protection but morale. Missions that had once been dreaded as flying suicides now carried a thread of hope. Gunners manning turrets spoke of Mustangs swooping in to scatter attackers, of radio calls echoing with calm assurance. The psychological bond between bombers and escorts deepened, forging a sense of invincibility that spread through the American air arm. German commanders tried to adapt. They shifted tactics, ordered dispersals, even experimented with desperate measures. Rocket fighters, jet prototypes, ramming missions. None could counter the combined weight of Mustang dominance and Allied production. For every new German machine, a dozen Mustangs appeared. For every desperate gamble, an overwhelming response. It was not just an air war. It was a war of endurance, and the Luftwaffe was gasping its last breath. Strategically, the collapse of German air power opened the gates for everything that followed. D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy, unfolded beneath skies ruled entirely by Allied fighters. Mustangs and Thunderbolts swept the beaches, strafing bunkers, pounding convoys, ensuring that no German reinforcement could move by daylight without being annihilated. The Luftwaffe's absence was conspicuous, its impotence undeniable. For German troops on the ground, it was as if the gods who once watched from above had abandoned them entirely. The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. In German cities, civilians watched their skies burn. Once the Luftwaffe had been their shield, intercepting raids, promising protection. Now mothers and children huddled in shelters, listening as bombs fell unchecked, knowing no savior would rise into the air. Rumors spread of American fighters machine-gunning trains, of Mustangs chasing refugees on roads. Whether true or exaggerated, the stories fueled despair. The enemy was everywhere, unstoppable, omnipresent. Even among Germany's highest ranks, despair crept in. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring admitted privately that control of the skies was lost, that no general, no plan could counter the Allied flood. Hermann Göring, once the swaggering architect of the Luftwaffe, listened as Hitler raged about betrayal, about weakness, about cowardice. In truth, it was not betrayal or cowardice, it was inevitability. The Americans had built a weapon that erased the Luftwaffe's edge, and with it the Reich's future. By the spring of 1945, the skies over Germany belonged wholly to the enemy. Mustangs swept unchallenged from horizon to horizon, their pilots circling like vultures over a carcass. German cities lay in ruins, their factories silent, their soldiers broken. The mockery of weak pilots had become a bitter memory, a cruel reminder of arrogance turned to ashes. The Luftwaffe's collapse was not just military, it was psychological. Their force once feared across continents, now inspired only pity, its legacy reduced to scattered wreckage across fields and forests. The Mustang had not only won the skies, it had broken the spirit of an enemy who once believed itself untouchable. In the end, the Germans learned what their mockery had blinded them to. War is not won by arrogance, but by adaptation. The Americans had adapted. They had turned ridicule into resolve, weakness into strength, and in doing so, they had shattered the Luftwaffe's wings forever. When the smoke finally cleared in May 1945, the sky over Europe belonged to the Silver Wings. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, once the hammer that had bloodied London and humbled France, was gone. Its aces lay buried, its airfields a graveyard of twisted steel, its legend broken. What had begun with mocking laughter, German pilots ridiculing American weak flyers, had ended in silence. Silence and the steady hum of Mustangs, circling like sentinels over a defeated Reich. The legacy of that transformation stretched far beyond the battlefields of the Second World War. The P-51 Mustang was more than an aircraft, it was a blueprint, a symbol, a revelation. It proved that war in the sky was not merely a contest of skill, or even of technology, but of integration. Range, communication, production, and psychology had fused into one weapon. The Mustang had taught the world that air power was not about isolated duels between fighters. It was about networks, about guardianship, about dominance that flowed from horizon to horizon. For Germany, the lesson was bitter. Their machines had been marvels of engineering, fast, powerful, precise, but their system was brittle. Aces could not be everywhere. Factories could not keep pace. Radios crackled with static. Coordination frayed, and arrogance blinded them to change. "We built the better aircraft," one German officer admitted after the war, but they built the better war. It was not a failure of metal, but a failure of foresight. For the Allies, the lesson became doctrine. In the Cold War years that followed, the Mustang's legacy lived on in the concept of air superiority, an absolute requirement for modern war. Jet fighters replaced piston engines, missiles replaced guns. But the philosophy remained the same: dominate the skies, and the enemy's fate on the ground is sealed. American strategists carried this truth into Korea, into Vietnam, and into the Gulf, where aircraft once again flew with the same principle that guided the Mustangs: stay, protect, coordinate, overwhelm. The echoes of the Mustang can be heard in the roar of the F-86 Sabre, in the scream of the F-15 Eagle, in the stealth of the F-22 Raptor. Each one bore the same DNA: speed, reach, connectivity, and the will to hunt the hunter. The Luftwaffe's mistake became the world's warning. Never underestimate your enemy. Never laugh at weakness, for weakness given time and purpose can become strength beyond measure. For the men who flew them, the Mustang was more than a machine. Veterans remembered the way it felt in their hands, the way its engine seemed alive beneath them. They remembered the relief of seeing silver wings appear beside their bombers, the pride of knowing they were no longer lambs led to slaughter, but part of a force that could strike back. For many, the Mustang became a memory stitched into their souls, a sound that never left their dreams, the whistle of air across its wings, the roar of its Merlin engine, the smell of oil and smoke in the cockpit. Families of airmen who never returned looked at the Mustang with mixed hearts. It was the weapon that came too late for some, but it was also the shield that saved thousands. Each squadron that flew under its protection carried the hopes of mothers and wives, children and brothers who prayed for one more return, one more landing on a foggy English runway. And for Germany, its people learned the dark mirror of that story. Where once they had mocked, they now buried their sons. Where once they had cheered their aces, they now stood in ruins, their skies conquered, their cities in ashes. The laughter had turned to mourning, and the arrogance to regret. The Mustang's legacy endures not only in museums or air shows, but in the lesson it carved into history. It told the world that technology without humility is nothing, that arrogance is a poor shield, and that the underestimated opponent can become the most dangerous of all. It taught that in war, connection matters more than isolation, persistence more than speed, unity more than individual brilliance. As modern jets cut across today's skies, their pilots guided by satellites and radar, the ghosts of Mustangs still fly with them. They whisper reminders from another age. Never mock the weak, never underestimate the novice, never forget that even ridicule can fuel resolve. The Luftwaffe mocked America's weak pilots, and in that mockery, they planted the seed of their own destruction. In the end, the Mustang was not just a fighter, it was a message written in steel and fire. In modern war, supremacy does not belong to the arrogant. Supremacy belongs to those who adapt, who endure, who rise from weakness with the will to never be mocked again.